A strange view of the East End has sprung up among people I've noticed recently on YouTube, with many commentators creating an East End that had no cultural diversity in the past. Frankly, this is rubbish. Now, of course, there are newer groups that have come into the East End in the last 30 or 40 years or so, which weren't present here. But to imagine there was no diversity before that and it was all a land of Cockney geezers is pure nonsense. I grew up in the East End. I was born in 1972 to parents who emigrated from Ireland to Hackney. I grew up mostly in the East End, in Hackney, and for a period of a year or so in Ireland when my mother was highly, well, terminally ill, to be frank, in my teens. Now, the immense nonsense talked about the East End by these commentators seems to try and insist that this vision of a white paradise where we're all white cockney geezers and pearly queens is complete rubbish. And I'm going to use a couple of books and resources from the history of the East End and set in places in the East End to show it's complete rubbish. I'm also going to use a silent movie, which is by a rather controversial director, but I can do nothing about him being controversial. It does prove my point, though. First, let's start with this is Israel Zangwill, The Children of the Ghetto. In its day, it was a very, very famous novel, and there was always a large Jewish community in parts of the East End, but it's moved around and lived in different areas. Let's have a potted description. Israel Zangwill's 1892 publication, which is the Victorian era, of course, The Children of the Ghetto, was a major hit in Britain and America, after being published in both London and Philadelphia and republished continually throughout the 20th century, and it's still quite a good read. As a son of Latvian and Polish immigrant parents, and mentioning that, there was quite a lot of Slavs who weren't Jewish here as well. Zangwill was a self-proclaimed Cockney Jew, and there were plenty of Cockney Jewish people when I was growing up. A label he devised while trying to straddle the divide that second generation immigrant children face in defining their identity in Britain. His family moved to the East End of London while he was under the age of 10 and subsequently attended the Jewish free schools in Spitalfields. And Spitalfields is not very far from where I'm sitting. If I was, say, a little bit fitter and decided to go and do a jog, I could be up to Spitalfields in 20 minutes running. He described that as an centre of Jewish Anglicisation. So the conflict between the two identities has always been there, and that's 133 years ago, and there were Jews here long before Israel was here. There is a Jewish cemetery 10 minutes walk away from me, and while most Jews live in Stamford Hill now in Hackney, that Jewish cemetery is still there and maintained, and there is another small one that's hard to see between two blocks of buildings where it's a bit buried, which I'll let you know it's there. You can't really tell. But leaving that aside, other groups that were here, we had the Chinese at Limehouse in the East End of London. And that led to a particular movie adapted from stories about the Chinese by the British writer Thomas Burke. Now, I'm going to read about the first part of Thomas Burke's stories, and I apologise for some of the dated language, which is not politically correct. It was less offensive in his time, and Thomas Burke can't be held to rights for using language of his own era. The Chink and the Child. It is a tale of love and lovers that they tell in the low-lit causeway that slinks from West India Dock Road to the dark waste of waters beyond. In Pennyfields, too, you may hear it. And I do not doubt it is told in faraway Taiping, in Singapore, in Tokyo, in Shanghai, and those other gay lamp haunts of wonder whether the wandering people of Limehouse go and whence they return so casually. Now remember, Thomas Burke was there. And although Thomas Burke may be rather, I should say, combining groups there, and he at least, you have to admit that he knew there were Chinese people there, and quite a lot in Limehouse. And Limehouse Nights is still a book that's studied and read widely. But more importantly, it led to this adaptation, Broken Blossoms, which started by W.D. Griffiths. Now, I'm uncertain about using W.D. Griffiths because I think most people watching may be well aware of the other movie W.D. Griffiths made, e.g. Birth of a Nation. But the fact that he made this in 1919, and it was a a big success and a smash hit, and the fact that people recognised that it represented a real part of London life shows that he wasn't just making stuff up, and neither was Thomas Burke. It's a rather gloomy movie, and the fact that the Chinese character is played by someone doing well, what could be politely called yellow faces, has dated it somewhat. Although it's saved by the fact that it's got Lillian Gish, and Lillian Gish could act like do acting of a high quality after reading the ingredients on the back of a soup can. And she was also gorgeous as well, so she carries romantic roles easily. But this idea that sprung up of an East End that sort of, I don't know, 40 or 50 years ago was all white Cockney geishas, it's ludicrous. I've lived in the East End most of my life. I can remember my mother nursing alongside West Indian nurses and nurses from the Philippines 35, 36 years ago before she died. It's a view that's been foisted on people by sort of people, whether when they go on about how shall I put it politely? When they go on about cultural diversity, and when they talk about it, what they actually mean, most of the time, and I just won't spit it out, is they want less black people in the area. They just won't spit that out because, of course, that would be the ruination of them. Instead, they'll dress it up as sub-Saharans, or they'll talk about trends of population movement, or they'll talk about use silly stuff like lifted from American ideas about and start creating statistics of crime or whatever, but they'll never get to spit out what they have to say. I'd have more time for an honest racist or an honest bigot than that sort of talking around the houses business.